Before we begin, write in the comments which city and country you're watching from. This channel exists to record stories that should never have been forgotten. In August 1923, a librarian at Yale University discovered a sealed trunk in the basement archives marked "Personal Effects, Unclaimed 1865. Inside were hundreds of pages of handwritten manuscripts, translations of ancient Greek and Latin texts, philosophical treatises, literary criticism, historical analyses, and comparative studies of world religions. The writing was sophisticated, demonstrating fluency in at least 7 languages and engagement with classical and contemporary scholarship at the highest level. The librarian assumed the papers belonged to a forgotten Yale professor from the Civil War era. But attached to one manuscript was a faded document that changed everything, a slave auction receipt from 1832, listing among sold property one Negro boy, age approximately 8 years, noted for unusual quietness and observation. Name Solomon Price, $300. The librarian spent 2 years tracing the connection. And what he discovered was impossible. The scholarly manuscripts, work that demonstrated education equivalent to multiple advanced degrees, had been written by a man who had been enslaved until age 33, who had never attended a day of formal schooling, and whose intellectual abilities had been so threatening that a systematic effort was made to suppress, discredit, and ultimately erase any evidence that he had existed. His name was Solomon Wright. And the documents he left behind reveal a mind that engaged with Homer and Plato, analyzed American constitutional law, critiqued contemporary philosophy, and wrote literary works that rivaled published authors of his era. He did all of this while enslaved, while forbidden to read, while living in a society that insisted black people were intellectually incapable of such achievement. They fought to keep him invisible. They nearly succeeded, but his words survived to prove them wrong. The first record of Solomon appears in a South Carolina plantation ledger dated 1824. Male child, approximately newborn, born to Hannah, house servant, child healthy, to be raised for domestic service. The plantation belonged to Marcus Whitfield, a wealthy rice planter who was also unusual for his time. He was educated at Harvard, owned an extensive private library, and considered himself a scholar of classical literature and philosophy. His papers, donated to the South Carolina Historical Society by descendants in 1955, reveal a man who valued learning while simultaneously enslaving people he claimed were incapable of it. Solomon spent his early childhood in the Whitfield household, working as a house servant. For the first 8 years of his life, the plantation records show nothing remarkable about him. He was described as quiet, obedient, and attentive to tasks. But in 1832, something happened that would change everything. Marcus Whitfield's personal diary from June 1832, a most disturbing incident occurred today. I was reading aloud from my Homer. I do this occasionally to practice my Greek pronunciation. The boy, Solomon, age perhaps 8, was cleaning the room. After I finished a passage, the boy recited it back to me, in Greek, with perfect pronunciation and inflection. I was astonished. I questioned him sharply. He said, "Master, I have heard you read that passage many times. I remembered it." I tested him. I read several passages he had never heard before. He repeated them flawlessly after a single hearing. I then asked if he understood what the words meant. He hesitated, then said, "Some, master. I understand some." I spent an hour testing his comprehension. This child, never formally taught, has absorbed substantial Greek vocabulary and grammar simply by listening to me read. This should not be possible. Marcus Whitfield was confronting something that challenged his entire worldview. A black child demonstrating intellectual capacity that equaled or exceeded educated white adults. His diary continues, "I do not know what to do with this discovery. The boy is clearly extraordinary. My colleagues would say this proves nothing, that he is merely mimicking sounds without true understanding. But I have studied languages for 20 years, and I recognize genuine linguistic ability when I see it. Solomon is not mimicking. He is learning. And that terrifies me, because if he can learn Greek, what else can he learn? And what does that say about everything we claim regarding Negro mental capacity? Whitefield made a decision that would define Solomon's life. Instead of suppressing this ability, he would study it, privately, secretly, treating Solomon as an experiment to determine the limits of black intellectual capacity. Between 1832 and 1840, Marcus Whitefield conducted what he called the Solomon Project, a secret educational experiment. He gave Solomon access to his library, taught him to read English formally, violating South Carolina law, and began systematically exposing him to classical education: Latin, Greek, history, philosophy, mathematics, literature. Whitefield documented everything in journals he kept separate from his regular diary. September 1832, Solomon has learned to read English in 3 months. His progress exceeds any student I taught at Harvard. His memory is extraordinary. He forgets nothing. March 1833, Solomon is now reading Latin. I gave him Caesar's commentaries. He completed it in 1 week and provided a written analysis that demonstrated not just comprehension, but critical thinking about military strategy and political manipulation. The boy is 9 years old. November 1834. I introduced Solomon to Euclidean geometry. Within days, he was solving proofs independently. I tested him with problems that challenged me as an undergraduate. He solved them with an elegance that humbles me. June 1836. Solomon asked me today about philosophy. I gave him Plato's Republic. We now spend evenings discussing the nature of justice, the structure of ideal societies, and the relationship between knowledge and virtue. These conversations are the most intellectually stimulating exchanges I have had in years. I find myself forgetting that I am speaking with a 12-year-old enslaved boy. Then I remember, and I am filled with an emotion I cannot name, part wonder, part guilt, part fear. But Whitefield's experiment had a darker purpose. He wanted to determine whether Solomon's intelligence was genuine, or if it was, as racial pseudoscience claimed, merely mechanical imitation without true reasoning. He wanted to find the limit, the point where Solomon's supposed racial inferiority would reveal itself. He never found that limit, and that realization drove him to make increasingly desperate attempts to rationalize what he was witnessing. By 1840, Solomon was 16 years old and had effectively received the equivalent of a classical education that would have qualified him for admission to any university in America. He was fluent in Greek, Latin, French, and German. He had read extensively in history, philosophy, literature, and science. He could discuss Aristotle, debate Kant, analyze Shakespeare, and critique contemporary political theory. But he was enslaved. Legally, he was property, and the knowledge he possessed was dangerous, not just to him, but to the entire social system. Marcus Whitefield's journal from 1840 shows a man in crisis. I have created something I do not know how to manage. Solomon is now more educated than most graduates of Harvard. His understanding of classical texts exceeds that of most professors I studied under. Yesterday, he corrected my translation of a difficult passage in Thucydides. He was right, and I was wrong. A 16-year-old enslaved Negro corrected my Greek translation. What does this mean? What am I supposed to do with this information? If I announce Solomon's abilities publicly, I will be mocked, possibly ostracized. My colleagues will say I am deluded, that I have been tricked by a clever mimic, but I know what I have witnessed. Solomon is brilliant, genuinely, undeniably brilliant, and that fact destroys every assumption upon which our society is built. But before we continue with what happened next, write in the comments, what would you do if you discovered something that proved everything you believed was wrong? Would you accept the truth or protect the lie? In 1840, Solomon's existence as an educated slave became known beyond Marcus Whitfield's household. The catalyst was a visiting professor from the College of Charleston who encountered Solomon in Whitfield's library. The professor, Dr. Harrison Caldwell, described the incident in a letter to a colleague. "I visited Whitfield's plantation to examine some rare texts in his collection. While in his library, I encountered a young Negro man reading Virgil in the original Latin. Assuming he was merely holding the book, I asked him sarcastically if he understood what he was reading. He replied, in perfect Latin, with a quote from the Aeneid, and then proceeded to discuss Virgil's political purposes in writing the epic. I was stunned into silence." Whitfield appeared and seemed distressed by the encounter. Later, he explained that the Negro, named Solomon, has been educated as an experiment to test theories of racial capacity. Whitfield claims the boy has learned multiple languages and can discuss philosophy at university level. "I do not know what to make of this. If true, it challenges fundamental assumptions about Negro intellectual capacity. If false, if Solomon is merely repeating memorized phrases, then Whitfield has been deceived. I suspect deception because the alternative is too disturbing to accept." Dr. Caldwell told others about his encounter. Word spread through South Carolina's intellectual circles. Marcus Whitfield had an enslaved scholar on his plantation. Reactions ranged from curiosity to outrage, to demands that Solomon be examined by experts to determine if his abilities were genuine. Whitfield initially resisted these demands, wanting to keep Solomon's education private, but pressure mounted. In December 1840, he agreed to allow a formal examination. The examination took place in January 1841 at Whitfield's plantation. Present were 3 professors from the College of Charleston: Dr. Caldwell, Classics; Dr. William Mason, Philosophy; and Dr. Robert Pierce, Mathematics. Their stated purpose was to scientifically assess the intellectual capacity of the Negro called Solomon. A transcript of the examination was preserved in Whitfield's papers and later published in a historical journal in 1959. The transcript is remarkable. Dr. Caldwell: "Solomon, can you read this passage?" Presents Greek text. Solomon: "Reads passage from Homer's Odyssey in Greek with correct pronunciation." Dr. Caldwell: "Can you translate it to English?" Solomon: "Provides accurate translation." Dr. Caldwell: "The translation is correct, but this proves only memorization. Let us try something you cannot have encountered before. Presents obscure Greek philosophical text. Solomon: Reads and translates accurately, then provides interpretation of the philosophical argument." Dr. Mason: "Remarkable. But philosophy requires not just comprehension, but original thought. Solomon, what is your view on Plato's theory of forms?" Solomon: "Sir, Plato argues that physical objects are imperfect copies of perfect abstract forms. I find this metaphysically unconvincing. How can we claim certain knowledge of forms if we can only perceive imperfect copies? Plato's epistemology requires a leap of faith I find unjustified. Aristotle's empiricism seems more defensible." Dr. Mason: "You have read Aristotle." Solomon: "Yes, sir. Master Whitfield has allowed me to study the metaphysics and the Nicomachean ethics." Dr. Pierce: "Presents complex mathematical problem. Solve this." Solomon: "Solves problem correctly, explaining his reasoning." Dr. Pierce: This is university-level mathematics. How did you learn this?" Solomon: "I read Euclid's Elements and Newton's Principia, sir. The principles are clear once you understand the foundations." The examination continued for 6 hours. The professors tested Solomon's knowledge of literature, history, multiple languages, logic, and theology. He answered every question correctly, and often provided insights that demonstrated not just knowledge, but genuine analytical thinking. The professor's official report, dated January 1841, concluded, We have examined the Negro Solomon and find that he possesses extraordinary abilities. His linguistic capacity is genuine. He reads and translates ancient and modern languages with accuracy. His philosophical knowledge demonstrates comprehension, not mere memorization. His mathematical abilities exceed those of most college students. We cannot identify any subject in which he shows inadequacy. While we hesitate to draw broad conclusions from a single case, we must acknowledge that Solomon's abilities challenge common assumptions about Negro intellectual capacity. However, we suggest that Solomon may represent an extreme anomaly, an exception so rare as to have no bearing on general conclusions about racial differences. We recommend that Mr. Whitefield continue his experiment, but with greater discretion, as public knowledge of an educated Negro may inspire dangerous ideas among the enslaved population. The report acknowledged Solomon's genius, while simultaneously explaining it away as an anomaly. The professors could not deny what they had witnessed, but they could not accept its implications. So they declared Solomon an exception, so rare that he proved nothing. But word of the examination spread, and Solomon's existence became a subject of intense, often hostile debate. Between 1841 and 1845, Solomon became simultaneously famous and endangered. Pro-slavery advocates needed to discredit him. His existence was propaganda for abolitionists who argued that black people were intellectually equal to whites. Some claimed Solomon was a fraud, that Whitefield had coached him to repeat memorized phrases. Others claimed he was possessed or had somehow absorbed a white person's intelligence. Still others argued that even if genuine, he was so exceptional that he proved nothing about black people in general. Abolitionists, meanwhile, wanted to use Solomon as proof that slavery was unjust because enslaved people were fully human and intellectually capable. Frederick Douglass, the famous escaped slave and abolitionist, wrote about Solomon in his newspaper, The North Star, in 1843. "We have learned of a man called Solomon, enslaved in South Carolina, whose mastery of classical learning rivals that of any white scholar. His existence proves what we have always known, that the chains of slavery bind bodies, not minds. That black people, given opportunity, are capable of any intellectual achievement. The slaveholders know this. That is why they forbid education. That is why they fear Solomon, because he is living proof that their entire system is built on a lie." This attention made Solomon's life increasingly dangerous. Marcus Whitefield's journal from 1843. "I receive threatening letters weekly. Some demand I sell Solomon out of state. Others threaten violence if I continue exhibiting him. My neighbors avoid me, claiming I have created a dangerous precedent. They say other slaves will become uppity if they learn about Solomon. I'm advised to deal with the situation, meaning I should sell him, punish him into submission, or worse. I am trapped. I have educated this man, engaged with his brilliant mind for over a decade, and now I'm expected to destroy him for the crime of being intelligent while black. I do not know what to do." In 1845, Whitefield made a decision. He would free Solomon and help him escape to the north, where he could live openly as an educated free man. The plan was simple. Whitefield would manumit Solomon, legally free him, and provide him with money and documents to travel north. Solomon would go to Massachusetts, where he could perhaps teach, write, or continue his studies. But before the manumission could be completed, someone intervened. The resolution, preserved in state archives, whereas it has come to the attention of this legislature that a certain Negro slave called Solomon, property of Marcus Whitefield, has been educated in violation of state laws prohibiting Negro literacy, and whereas this Negro's education and public display have caused unrest and dangerous speculation about Negro capabilities, and whereas the continued existence of this educated Negro in our state poses a threat to social order and the institution of slavery. Therefore be it resolved that Marcus Whitfield is hereby ordered to 1. Cease all education of said Negro immediately. 2. Restrict said Negro from any contact with other enslaved persons. 3. Prohibit said Negro from reading or writing. 4. Surrender said Negro to state authorities if requested. In July 1845, the South Carolina legislature passed a resolution specifically targeting Solomon. Failure to comply will result in fines, seizure of property, and criminal charges. This resolution was extraordinary, an entire state legislature acting to suppress one person's knowledge. It demonstrated how threatening Solomon had become. Marcus Whitfield defied the order. On August 1st, 1845, he filed papers to manumit Solomon and provided him with funds to leave South Carolina immediately. Solomon left the plantation on August 3rd, 1845, headed north. He was 21 years old, finally free, carrying letters of introduction from Whitfield to abolitionist contacts in Massachusetts. He made it 70 miles before he was captured. Solomon's recapture was documented in multiple sources. Slave catchers, hired by unknown parties, intercepted him near the North Carolina border. They claimed he was a fugitive slave, despite carrying manumission papers proving he was free. The catchers brought Solomon back to South Carolina, where he was held in Charleston jail. Marcus Whitfield immediately filed legal challenges, arguing that Solomon was legally free and had been kidnapped. The case went to court. The trial, State of South Carolina versed. Marcus Whitfield, regarding the status of the Negro Solomon, took place in September 1845. Court transcripts reveal a proceeding that was less about law than about controlling a dangerous symbol. The prosecution argued that Whitfield's manumission was invalid because it was made under duress from abolitionist pressure and because Solomon, due to his education, posed a clear danger to public safety and therefore could not be freed under state law. Whitfield's attorney argued that the manumission was legal and that detaining a free man was kidnapping. But the most remarkable part of the trial was when the judge allowed Solomon to testify, an unusual allowance for a black person, free or enslaved, in 1845, South Carolina. Solomon's testimony as recorded: Judge: Solomon, do you understand the nature of these proceedings? Solomon: Yes, Your Honor. The court is determining whether I am legally free or whether my manumission is void. Judge: Can you read? Solomon: Yes, Your Honor. Judge: This is illegal. You know this violates state law? Solomon: Yes, Your Honor. I learned to read because Mr. Whitfield taught me. I did not choose to violate the law. I simply learned what I was taught. Judge: Do you understand that your education makes you dangerous? That other Negroes, seeing an educated Negro, might get ideas above their station? Solomon: Your Honor, I understand that my education threatens a system that depends on ignorance. But I would respectfully suggest that if a system requires people to remain ignorant to survive, then perhaps it is the system, not the knowledge, that is dangerous. The courtroom, according to newspaper accounts, erupted. The judge threatened Solomon with contempt. The prosecution called Solomon's response proof of the insolence that education breeds in the Negro race. The judge ruled against Whitfield. Solomon's manumission was declared void. He was remanded to custody as an enslaved person, but the judge did not return him to Whitfield. Instead, Solomon was sold at public auction to ensure he is placed with an owner who understands proper management of educated Negroes. Marcus Whitfield was fined $500 for illegally educating a slave and banned from owning enslaved people in the future. Solomon was sold to a plantation owner named Jeremiah Blackwood, known for harsh treatment of enslaved workers. The sale price was $1,800, 6 times what Solomon had been worth as a child, demonstrating that even those who wanted to suppress his knowledge recognized his value. Solomon's life under Jeremiah Blackwood was documented sparsely. Blackwood kept minimal records and was deliberately secretive about Solomon's abilities, but testimony from other enslaved people on Blackwood's plantation, collected by Freedmen's Bureau agents after the Civil War, provides some information. Mr. Blackwood bought Solomon because he heard Solomon could read and write and do figures. Mr. Blackwood used Solomon to keep his accounts, write his letters, and manage business. But he kept Solomon isolated from the rest of us. Solomon lived in a separate cabin. He wasn't allowed to talk to other slaves. If he did, Mr. Blackwood would have him whipped. They wanted Solomon's knowledge, but didn't want him sharing it. It was like they thought knowledge was catching, like a disease. Another testimony. Solomon tried to teach me to read once, just a few letters scratched in dirt. Mr. Blackwood found out. He had Solomon whipped 40 times and locked in a cell for a week. After that, Solomon stopped trying to teach anyone, but sometimes late at night we'd see light in his cabin. He was writing something, always writing. We didn't know what, but we knew he was hiding it from them. What Solomon was writing, hidden away in his cabin, would not be discovered for another 78 years. Between 1845 and 1860, Solomon worked as Jeremiah Blackwood's private secretary in all but name, managing correspondence, keeping accounts, and solving business problems. He was enslaved but functioned as an educated assistant. The contradiction was profound. Blackwood profited from Solomon's intelligence while publicly insisting that Negroes were intellectually inferior. And during those 15 years, Solomon documented everything. He wrote essays on slavery, on justice, on resistance. He translated classical texts and wrote original philosophical works. He kept a hidden journal that recorded his thoughts, his observations, and his analysis of American society. All of this was done in secret, written on whatever paper he could scavenge, hidden in walls and floorboards, preserved with the desperate hope that someday someone would find it and understand. The Civil War began in April 1861. South Carolina was the first state to secede. The Blackwood plantation, like all Southern plantations, was immediately affected by the chaos of war. Solomon was 37 years old when the war began. According to later testimony, he predicted the South would lose, a prediction that earned him another whipping when Blackwood overheard him expressing it to another enslaved person. But Solomon's prediction, like so many of his assessments, proved accurate. The war lasted 4 years and ended with Confederate defeat. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 technically freed enslaved people in Confederate territories, though enforcement was impossible until Union victory. Solomon remained enslaved until April 1865, when Union troops reached the Blackwood plantation. A Union Army chaplain's report from April 1865 describes meeting Solomon. Encountered today an extraordinary individual, a Negro man named Solomon, who has been enslaved his entire life, but who speaks with the erudition of a college professor. He conversed with me in Latin, discussed classical philosophy, and provided political analysis of the war's conclusion that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of constitutional law and geopolitics. When I expressed astonishment at his education, he explained he had been taught by his former master, but forbidden to use that knowledge openly. He said, "I have been free in my mind for 33 years, chaplain. Today my body finally caught up. I have never encountered anyone quite like him. Solomon was free. At age 41 he could finally live openly as an educated man, could use his knowledge without hiding, could perhaps achieve what his abilities deserved. But freedom came with challenges. Solomon had no money, no connections in the North, and was entering a world where black intellectuals were still viewed with suspicion by many white people. And he was no longer young. Years of slavery and suppression had taken their toll. In June 1865, Solomon traveled to Massachusetts, carrying letters of introduction to abolitionist contacts and to several universities. He hoped to find work as a teacher or translator to finally use his classical education openly. The reception was mixed. Abolitionists welcomed him as a living argument for black equality, but academic institutions were less enthusiastic. A letter from Harvard University's Classics Department responding to Solomon's inquiry about teaching positions. Dear Mr. Wright, we acknowledge your impressive self-education and commend your scholarly pursuits. However, Harvard's faculty positions require formal degrees and established academic credentials. While your knowledge is clearly substantial, we cannot appoint someone without proper certification to teach our students. We wish you success in finding appropriate employment, but cannot offer a position at this institution. Similar letters came from Yale, Brown, and other universities. They acknowledged Solomon's knowledge, but refused to hire him because he lacked formal credentials that had been impossible for him to obtain while enslaved. Solomon found work teaching in schools for freed people, institutions established across the South to educate formerly enslaved children and adults. He taught in Richmond, Virginia from 1866 to 1870, then in Atlanta from 1870 to 1873. Letters from students and colleagues reveal Solomon's impact. Professor Wright is the finest teacher I have known. He makes ancient Greek come alive. He helps us understand that we are heirs to a classical tradition that belongs to all humanity, not just to white people. He teaches us Latin and philosophy, but also pride in our capacity to learn, to think, to engage with great ideas. Another letter. Solomon Wright is proof that slavery could chain the body but never the mind. His brilliance challenges every lie told about our people. But I worry for him. He seems tired, worn down by years of fighting to be seen as human. Sometimes I see deep sadness in his eyes, the sadness of a man who was forced to hide his genius for most of his life, and who now sees that even in freedom, full recognition eludes him. Solomon taught for 7 years, educating hundreds of formerly enslaved people, helping them build lives in freedom. But he was growing weaker. Decades of stress, poor conditions, and suppressed potential had damaged his health. In 1873, Solomon collapsed while teaching. He was diagnosed with consumption, tuberculosis, and told he had perhaps a year to live. He used that year to prepare his legacy. Solomon Wright died on November 3, 1874, in Atlanta, age 50. His obituary in the Atlanta Daily World: Solomon Wright, educator and classical scholar, has passed. Mr. Wright was known among the freed people's community as an exceptional teacher who brought classical education to students previously denied such learning. Born into slavery, he educated himself and devoted his later years to educating others. He is survived by no immediate family, but by hundreds of students who will remember his dedication and brilliance. Services will be held at Friendship Baptist Church. Solomon died with minimal possessions. But before his death, he arranged for a trunk containing his life's work, all the manuscripts he had written while enslaved, all the translations and philosophical writings, all the hidden journals, to be sent to Yale University with a letter. To whom it may concern, I am Solomon Wright. I am dying of consumption. I was enslaved from birth until 1865. During my enslavement, I taught myself classical languages, philosophy, history, and literature. I was examined by professors and found competent, yet I was kept enslaved because my knowledge threatened the social order. I am sending you my life's work, translations, essays, analyses, and journals documenting my intellectual development and my observations on slavery, justice, and American society. I do not expect these papers to be published or even read during my lifetime, but I need them to exist somewhere safe, where someday someone might discover them and understand. I existed, I thought, I learned, and everything they said about black intellectual inferiority was a lie. Please preserve these papers. They are proof. Solomon Wright, October 1874. The trunk arrived at Yale in December 1874, was catalogued as unclaimed personal effects, and was stored in the basement archives. It remained there unopened for 49 years. When he opened it and began reading the manuscripts, he later described his reaction. "I felt as if I was excavating a lost civilization, but the civilization was one man's mind." The trunk contained over 600 pages of Solomon's work. Translations of Greek and Latin texts, including complete translations of Homer's Iliad and portions of Plato's dialogues, original philosophical essays on justice, freedom, knowledge, and human nature, literary criticism analyzing Shakespeare, Milton, and contemporary American literature, historical analysis of ancient Rome with implicit comparisons to American slavery, a 200-page journal documenting his years under Jeremiah Blackwood, written in a mixture of English, Latin, and Greek. Perhaps to prevent discovery, every page demonstrated sophisticated scholarship. In 1923, a librarian named Thomas Henderson, organizing old archives, found the sealed trunk. Henderson spent 6 months analyzing the work and consulting with classics professors. Their conclusion: Solomon Wright had been a legitimate scholar whose work could have contributed significantly to classical studies if he had been allowed to work openly. Henderson published his findings in 1925, The Hidden Scholar, Discovering Solomon Wright. The article caused controversy. Some scholars praised Solomon's achievement. Others questioned whether an enslaved man could truly have produced such sophisticated work, suggesting the manuscripts might be forgeries or that Solomon had plagiarized from published sources. This skepticism, even in 1925, 60 years after slavery ended, demonstrated the enduring power of racist assumptions. Even when presented with undeniable evidence of black intellectual achievement, some people preferred to believe the evidence was false rather than challenge their prejudices. But most scholars who examined Solomon's work recognized its authenticity. The translations were accurate, the philosophical arguments were original, and the historical context matched Solomon's life perfectly. By the 1930s, academic consensus accepted that Solomon Wright had been exactly what the documents proved: a brilliant classical scholar whose potential had been systematically suppressed. Solomon's story spread gradually through academic and black intellectual circles. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about him in 1930. Solomon Wright represents thousands of enslaved people whose intellectual abilities were destroyed by slavery. For every Solomon whose work survived, there were countless others whose genius was completely erased. We must remember him not just as an exceptional individual, but as evidence of what slavery destroyed: human potential on a massive scale. In 1945, a black classical scholar named Dr. Patricia Johnson completed her PhD dissertation on Solomon Wright's philosophical work. She wrote, "Wright's essays on justice anticipate arguments that wouldn't become mainstream in philosophy for another century. His analysis of power structures shows sophistication that rivals contemporary political philosophers. Had he been born free and white, he would be studied in philosophy courses today. Instead, his work was hidden for 50 years after his death." This is not just Solomon's tragedy. It's a tragedy for all of us who were deprived of his contributions. In 1955, Yale University Press published a collection of Solomon's translations and essays, The Writings of Solomon Wright, a Forgotten Classical Scholar. The book sold modestly, primarily to academics and black intellectuals, but it ensured Solomon's work would survive. And in 1968, during the civil rights movement, Solomon's story gained new relevance. Activists pointed to him as proof that black intellectual capacity had never been the question, only white willingness to recognize it. A speech by a black student activist at Yale in 1968. Solomon Wright studied at this university, but only after he died. He sent his life's work here in 1874. They stored it in a basement for 50 years. He was brilliant enough to teach here, but not acceptable to employ here. That's not about his qualifications, that's about their racism. We're here today, demanding that Yale acknowledge its role in suppressing scholars like Solomon Wright. His story isn't ancient history. It's about how institutions claim to value knowledge while restricting who gets to produce it. Today, Solomon Wright's papers are preserved in Yale's Beinecke Rare Book Library. Scholars occasionally study his translations, which are recognized as accurate and insightful. His philosophical essays are sometimes cited in academic work on slavery and resistance. A marble memorial was placed at Yale in 1995. Solomon Wright, 1824-1874. Classical scholar whose brilliance was suppressed by slavery, but whose work survived to challenge the lies built on that suppression. His legacy reminds us that genius has no color, only witnesses who refuse to see it. But perhaps Solomon's most important legacy is in the questions his story forces us to ask. How many other Solomons were there? How many enslaved people possessed extraordinary intellectual abilities that were completely destroyed? How much knowledge was lost? How many contributions to human understanding were prevented? We will never know. Because for every Solomon who managed to document his knowledge and preserve it against impossible odds, there were thousands whose abilities were erased entirely. A passage from Solomon's journal, written in 1858 while still enslaved, speaks to this. "I write these words knowing they may never be read, but I write them anyway because I need to believe that truth matters, that knowledge matters, that my thoughts matter, even if no one acknowledges them. I've spent 34 years proving I'm intelligent to people who benefit from believing I am not. I've translated Homer while enslaved. I have debated philosophy while forbidden to speak freely. I have understood the contradictions of a society that proclaims liberty while practicing bondage. And I have documented it all, hidden away, hoping that someday someone will find these pages and understand. We were always human. We were always thinking. We were always capable. They just refused to see it. But the truth survives, waiting to be discovered. That is my hope. That is why I write." The final document in Solomon's trunk was a letter written in 1874, days before his death, addressed to future scholars. "I am dying. The consumption has taken my body, but my mind remains clear until the end. I want to leave you with this understanding. I am not exceptional. My abilities are not supernatural or impossible. What I achieved, teaching myself classical languages, engaging with philosophy and literature, thinking critically about the world, these are things that thousands of enslaved people could have achieved if given opportunity. The extraordinary thing is not that I learned. The extraordinary thing is that I was able to preserve some record of that learning despite every effort to suppress it. For every manuscript I saved, there were 10 I had to destroy to avoid punishment. For every thought I recorded, there were 100 I kept hidden. And I am only one person. Imagine the collective knowledge that was destroyed by slavery. Imagine the scholars who never got to write anything down, the thinkers who were worked to death before they could develop their ideas, the brilliant minds that were deliberately suppressed into silence. That is the true tragedy of slavery. Not just the physical brutality, though that was horrific, but the intellectual annihilation. The systematic destruction of human potential on an industrial scale. I leave you these papers as evidence. Evidence that we thought, we learned, we understood. Evidence that the justifications for our bondage were lies. Evidence that human capacity transcends race, and that the only thing that limited us was their determination to keep us limited. Use this evidence. Teach it. Share it. Do not let us be forgotten again. We were scholars. We were thinkers. We were human. And that truth, once known, cannot be unknown. That is immortality enough. Solomon Wright, October 1874. If this story moved you, leave a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe to this channel. Solomon Wright's manuscripts sit in a library at Yale University, available for anyone to study. But most people don't know they exist. Most people don't know his name. We're changing that. One story at a time. They fought to keep him invisible. They nearly succeeded, but his words survived, and now we know the truth. Solomon Wright, scholar, philosopher, translator, and living proof that knowledge has no color. Only witnesses too invested in lies to see the truth.